using this opportunity, I would like to express my thankfulness again to NGBK, Between Bridges, and Galerie Prata for hosting and conceiving this project together. My name is Vasil Cherepanin. I represent the Visual Culture Research Center, which is the institutional organizer of the Kyiv Biennial. And as we have been quite extensively researching and investigating throughout the whole project that we started at the end of February, the idea of evidence and how the notion of a document has changed through the war, at war, and due to the war. I'm really happy that we are able to host tonight the presentation by the Center for Spatial Technologies, which is partly based in Kyiv and partly in Berlin. And today's presentation will be dedicated to it's titled "A City Within a Building," the Russian airstrike on the Mariupol Drama Theatre. And that's actually one of the worst Russian military atrocities throughout the last 2 years, since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. One of the worst atrocities committed against the Ukrainian civilian population. And I'm really grateful that we have such renowned speakers tonight. They actually represent a couple of institutions. The whole research and investigation has been conducted by the Center for Spatial Technologies itself, but at the same time, so just to represent and introduce shortly the center as an institution, which is a transdisciplinary group working on the intersection of investigative, architectural, and artistic practices. And of course, over the last 2 years, the center has been very much focusing on the theme of war crimes and human rights violations. And the center collaborates with different artistic as well as research institutions, grassroots initiatives, human rights and forensic organizations, and working with a broad range of topicalities, usually using spatial analysis and visualization techniques. And of course, now all the efforts of the center are being directed towards analyzing civilian damage caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The center also cooperates quite closely with Forensic Architecture, a very famous research group based at Goldsmith in London. Among the project of the Center for Spatial Technologies, I would just name a few. I think of particular interest is the investigation of the Russian strike on the Kyiv TV tower, which is quite symbolic because we are sitting actually next to the Berlin famous TV tower. But also the research of Baben Yar, infamous mass killing, mass massacre site from the Nazi times, known as the so-called Holocaust by bullets. And at the same time, there is another organization, the European Center for Constitutional Human Rights, that kindly agreed to join us today. So thanks so much for both organizations. I would just shortly introduce our speakers. First of all, in the row of the presentations that we will see and hear today, Maksym Rokmaniiko, Ukrainian architect, researcher, and educator whose work emphasizes the use of spatial modeling technologies and as a mode of inquiry into the urban condition. He is the founding director of the Center for Spatial Technologies. Then Isabelle Haßfurther, thanks so much for joining too, a legal advisor at the Berlin-based European Center for Constitutional Human Rights, who focuses on accountability for international crimes committed in the context of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And she has been supporting survivors, providing strategic legal interventions in various European jurisdictions. And also Svitlana Matviyenko, my dear colleague with whom we have been within the Kyiv Perennial framework collaborating really a lot. Svitlana is an associate professor of critical media analysis in the School of Communication at the Simon Fraser University in Canada, and associate professor of Digital Democracies Institute. And her research and teaching are very much focused on information and cyber war, media and environment, critical infrastructure studies, and post-colonial theory. And she has been, throughout the last 2 years, has been extensively working on the practices of nuclear terror, weaponization of pollution and technogenic catastrophes due to the Russia's war of invasion against Ukraine, and we will hear about that from Svitlana today. And she's a co-author of a very, very important book. I just hope that it will be published in German, Cyber War and Revolution, Digital Subterfuge in Global Capitalism. So as I just mentioned, before I pass a microphone to the colleagues of mine today, I just wanted to shortly say that this research that is being presented tonight is actually for the first time that is became publicly available in such a thorough form. It's not by occasion that it's taken place today, because it's almost marking the second year of the respective Russian missile strike on the Mariupol Drama Theatre, which took place on the 16th of March 2022. And this research very much focuses on the 3-week period between the start of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine and the date of the strike itself. But what I particularly find super important, especially for the media context here in this country, is indeed a profound intersectional and transdisciplinary approach that the center has been sticking to in order to provide and to conduct this research. Because in one case we actually have so many different dimensions, and especially keeping in mind the background of the city of Mariupol itself. These all dimensions and aspects are actually are so classical and somehow are even coming from the, I would say, even ancient Greek times, because in one case we have polemos, a war, we have the idea of polis, a city, we have drama, a deed or an act, we have trageion, tragedy, we have trauma, right, a wound, and we have theatron, which is theater, right, and which literally means in Greek a place of seeing, and that's actually what is so much required today. So this is really a significant research, because even for that matter it embraces architectural study, historical and urban background, sociological approach, anthropological dimension, forensic investigation, military analysis. So this transdisciplinarity is really crucial indeed. So I am passing the microphone to Maksym first, and we are looking forward to your presentation. So what are the methodologies that you embraced? How did you practically work with the case? And what are your findings? Thank you so much again.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction, Vasil, and thank you for generally organizing this series of events. It's been very nice to be able to see other events as well. My name is Maksym, as Vasil introduced me, and I represent a lot of collective work done by the Center for Spatial Technologies, also by colleagues that kind of come from outside of our center, but today I will show something that we are very anxious to share. It's something that will come out, as Vasil mentioned, the second year of this attack is coming very soon on the 16th of March. And towards that day, we are preparing the results of our research that will be published on the website. And basically what I'm going to do today is to go through all of these findings and to share them in this very nice company of yours. And I will basically go through now through the structure of this presentation and the structure of materials that we prepared. And as I will speak, I'll talk a little bit about our work with testimonies, which is something that it kind of is at the core of this work. I'll share how we work with the witnesses and also how this work has been supported by visual materials, by 3D models. So that's kind of the big part of my presentation. And then as part of this work, we also collaborated a lot with academics, scholars, and experts who kind of surround me today, and they will also present their bits of contribution to this general project. So, as Vasily already said, on 16th of March 2022, the Russian Air Force conducted an air bombing of Mariupol Drama Theatre, and in the lead up to this strike, the theater worked as a shelter, as a civilian shelter for thousands of civilians. The few minutes after the explosion, people were, those who managed to survive the explosion were kind of seen exiting the theater for the last time, as you will see on the footage above. The history of this particular place is such that we could never see the site of the crime. Very soon after, on the 28th of March, the Russian forces captured the city center where the theater is located, and they very quickly started to cover up the crime. So they started to fabricate evidence, tell lies about what actually happened, of course accusing Ukrainian side of a false flag operation, but also making things like this, which Svitlana will talk about, organizing concerts, basically surrounding the building with a scaffolding, and then bulldozing the specific part of the building that remained after the strike, where the explosion happened, bulldozing that to the ground. And what you see here are the phases that precede so-called reconstruction of the theater. So it's very hard to observe from the outside what's going on at this kind of at the site, the schizophrenic reality of it, and to explode this black box of denial and obfuscation, we are working to assemble this archive that is meant to really support the testimonies of people who were in the theater. So very closely we worked with these people using this technique called saturated testimony. You will hear about it in a moment. And of course, our role in this process was to conduct these interviews with people, but also to support their testimony with materials of our spatial research. By that I mean all of these collected media that were carefully organized and put together by our researchers. And also the medium where they were all put together is really the space of the theater. So here you can see the witnesses, the walkthroughs through the theater, and even after this first video was made, there's been kind of news coming out. There's already first floor of the theater that the Russian forces there kind of raising as if nothing happened. So of course it's the whole attack and the whole operation of conducting this attack in a moment when the city is completely cut off from electricity, from internet, from all other forms of infrastructure is not accidental. We have this very kind of clearly communicative violence that at the same time is counting on the fact that it cannot be brought to accountability as it was not brought to accountability in numerous other Russian wars before. But in this case, for us, it was very important to gather these people who, of course, as a result of the war, are now scattered all around Europe and Ukraine, to basically gather their voices and to bring them together through this process of digital reconstruction. So we originally identified 60 people who were in the theater or who were somehow witnesses of these events. And out of those people, a little bit less than half, 27, participated in in-depth interviews with the team. So during the in-depth interviews, we talked to witnesses, we asked them about their experience as they wanted to share them, and we asked only few spatial questions. We tried to understand where those people were, what kinds of things they saw. And based on this information, we invited 10 witnesses to participate in further sessions. Using this technique, this called situated testimony, it's a technique that is developed by our colleagues at Forensic Architecture. And this reconstruction process allows the survivors to walk through the virtual space and model different aspects of the building as they remember it. So you will see a couple of examples of that in a little bit. I'll just say that this is a process that is meant to facilitate recollection. Each witness recalled part of the events that they remembered, and this in the end basically assembled the model that you saw in the beginning that was spinning, where all of these models together combined, they kind of show our understanding of the events as per the witnesses. So here you can see the process of recording these witnesses in our offices in Berlin and Kyiv. The witnesses are surrounded by two people, by an interviewer and by a 3D modeler. And we are very, very much looking forward to publish these materials. We'll publish this on the 16th of March. We're extremely hopeful that they will be watched. For us, it's very important to make sure that this information that was passed to us by the witnesses of the event is out there and is present. I'll show you a little bit of how it works, just playing a short fragment.
Двоє діток, старший Артем, 7 років виповнилося, а менша Настя, їй виповнилося 3 роки.
Добре. А ваше місце?
А мы вот здесь расстелили штору. А у нас было кресло компьютерное, возле колонны оно у нас стояло.
Спинкою доверху, так? Чи...
Да. Ми потім взяли деталь з декорацій і поставили перед цією колоною, бо нам дуло з виходу.
Отут, між цим?
Да. Просто у нас лежали діти, щоб їм не так дуло. А навпроти нас, у нас там було колони і стояли ці стульчики. Ну, не стульчики, а кресла для этого, в театрі, на которых сидять. Нам просто, щоб лягти, ми загороджували прохід, коли лягали. У нас тут не лишалося простору, щоб пройти.
So this is just an example of how this process works and how it's later collected into our videos that we are publishing. And here you can see examples of this space as we combined all the models of different witnesses. You can see the pianos that people positioned in slightly different locations, but in this way there's a polyphony of their voices. There's a little bit of a difference in terms of how they remember the space, but at the same time there's very clear convergence. We understand, for instance, from the testimonies that people were constantly hearing sounds of airplanes. They mention it extensively. We also have a lot of footage where we can hear them say that even the theater was blown up by an air bomb. And this space for us is very important. It's important because for the first time we kind of understood what we actually went through with these witnesses, what kinds of spaces we understand. It's very easy to using these models to dismiss Russian claims, of course, because according to Russian propaganda, probably some of you know that the claim was that people were held hostage and there was explosion that was brought into the theater. In any case, not only it's very easy to dismiss things like that with models like this, but we also understand which spaces in the theater were more active and what kinds of things were going on there. So In this particular case, we have basically a virtual model that collects in itself multiple stories. And if I look at different objects here, I understand which witnesses contributed these models, and we can go to those witnesses. And for us, it's also a very good and effective way to tell the story of the building. So in the end of each of these interviews, we have a spinning model of a theater where we say that this particular witness interview of whom you just watched contributed these models to our research. And we also add that together with the models that all of our witnesses produced combined, they form really the basis of the study. And it's important for us because we can also, through this, understand a little bit of what the Russian air bombing destroyed, right? Here you saw the spinning model of things that people produced as kind of immediate objects that they interacted with while they were in the theater. And here you can see a superimposition of that model onto a photogrammetry that was produced by my colleague Mykola, where you can see the destroyed building, right? The destroyed building where you can also see where was the epicenter of explosion and how it superimposes again with these kind of objects that people modeled during their interviews. It means that doesn't mean that they were there at the moment of explosion, of course, but it means that they were in these places during their time in the theater. So I'll talk a bit about models. In the very beginning of the work, we went to archives. We got these beautiful drawings of the theater, and we got the first model of the theater very quickly. We also produced a lot of photogrammetries, which are these kind of processes where you turn videos or sets of images into models. For instance, this is a photogrammetry that is kind of just very high resolution, so sometimes people ask us where these photographs come from. These models were very important for us because we used them in the course of situated testimonies. We also at some point realized that the Mariupol theater is built according to multiple use projects, so-called, where multiple theaters in Ukraine were built according to this project. And they actually look different on the facade, and the spaces inside are identical. So we went to, well, other than some small details of decor, we went to the theater in Poltava and we got these scans. On these scans you can see the space of Poltava theater, and of course it was very useful for us because sometimes our witnesses were just saying like, okay, I was here. They very clearly understood and read the space, and we also used these models sometimes during the situated testimonies. We also learned a lot about space from the witnesses. So here you can see the process where the witnesses, of course, interacting a lot with the screen and with the modeler, but here there's also a set of drawings that they're kind of interacting with, and sometimes they, of course, corrected us. For instance, these are drawings made by the couple. He is an actor and she's a lighting engineer in the theater. And they knew the space very well. They worked almost 20 years in the theater, and they were telling us, sorry, this door is opening opposite direction. Not only they knew the space of the theater very well, they also understood the presence or non-presence of people in different spaces in the theater. So these drawings specifically have these sheets where we asked them to mark where were the people and how many, and also these are quite important for us to understand the space of the building. And as you could see in the video, we also always work not only with one type of media, not only with one witness, not only with combination of different witness testimonies, but in this case also photographs are located in the space of the theater hall, and then, of course, witnesses interact with the spatial models, as I mentioned. So, speaking about this photographs and about visual materials, we have collected over 1,000 different pictures and videos. They come from different phases of a theater's life. It's a historic building, so it starts from the time when it was constructed, and it stands in the very important historical location where the biggest church in Mariupol stood and so on. So I'll not go into details of that now. But of course, it was very important for us to work with this media, right? To kind of get as much as possible from the very limited amount of photographs and videos that we had, because you probably know, Mariupol was under siege. It was very hard to transmit information from inside of the siege. There was no charge on anyone's phone. It's a miracle that some people made this media. And also, of course, they all had to go through filtration camps where the phones were screened, and either the Russian soldiers who were conducting this filtration deleted these important pieces of evidence, or people being fearful of filtration deleted them themselves. So in any case, it was very important for us to work with these things. And so here you can see media arranged in timelines. We kind of very carefully worked with everything that we gathered, and here you can see an example of how a photograph is being located against a 3D model. This is a process that was also conducted by the team, and we actually located almost all the media that we gathered in the first round of this work. It's also possible to locate videos, by the way. But even with videos, we then split them into frames, for instance. Sometimes you watch a video and something happens in one of the frames, you don't notice it. It's very important for us to, again, get as much as possible from the limited amount of information we can. Sometimes it's helpful to not just see each frame carefully, but it's important to see the panoramic image and to see what's going on in this particular place. For instance, it's much easier to count people, right? Like here you can kind of estimate what's going on or what kinds of processes are happening. So we also try to understand, this is the field kitchen, right? The place where people cooked food for almost 2,000 people. Here you can see different ways they cooked food, but and this is an example of how we work with these collections of media. But also you can see from these two panoramas quite well what happened, right? The field kitchen, where the volunteers cooked food, where there were these gatherings of people. I don't know if you can see well the image above. There's over 50 people on this image doing different things, preparing food, for some reason on this particular image there's quite little people specifically inside the field kitchen, but there's a lot of people around. And below you can see the same location a little bit from another angle, where basically the place where the center of this image is under the rubble. So it's very important for us to work with everything we can get and to get as much as possible from this. And of course, in this case, I'm talking only about relationship between different images and how this kind of combination of images is much stronger than any individual image. But in the following video, it's going to be clear how that's also strengthened by a witness.
Польова кухня стояла чітко, де от эта труба, і що під неї хренячила якраз вода. Да, вот это она. Напротив трубы ставь ее. Вот где сливная труба красная. С крыши которая. Четко, только наоборот прицепом разверни. От полевки, начиная, оставь место метр, где-то полтора, наверное, метра. И заставь это все 800-литровыми здоровыми пластмассовыми этими бочками. 3 было. 3 бочки, дальше все мы закидали палетами деревянными. Чтобы не прострелили, чтобы осколки, и не видно нас было. Тут же война шла. Само с утра уже пацаны вставали в 5. Уже печка уже дымела. Истопники. Вот этот Саша и второго Игорь. Вот это они погибли там. И вот это все, весь вот этот этаж обрушился. И по вот это весь тротуар, все вот так вот. Не помню, какой день влепили сюда машину с водой. И тут очередь собралась, прикинь, людей куча. Говорю, куда? Говорю, сейчас, не дай бог, говорю, увидеть столпотворение. Говорю, лупанут. Уже самолет, каждый день самолет летал. Бомбил постоянно.
Город со всех сторон горит.
Говорю, сейчас будет просто элементарный удар. Говорю, ляжем тут все. Говорю, они же бьют по людям. Что вы, говорю, творите?
Это самолетик летает.
This particular video was filmed on the 15th of March, and what's going on here is a field kitchen at the time of the sunset. So it's closer to evening when people are making lunch. And also one of the voices is saying that the city is burning from all sides. So when we worked with the witnesses and when we worked with the space of the theater, we asked questions that were focused, relatively focused spatially. We still heard a lot about destruction of the city. And this is something that we will address a little bit more later, but it's very important to say that through this specific location, through looking at it very carefully, we could understand a lot about environment around. And
Уже ближний бой, близко к центру. С Калашникова перестрелка. Вот горит центральный рынок. Центральный рынок сбрасывает бомбы, по 3, по 4 бомбы каждый день. Начиная с 26 февраля, сегодня уже 16. Такое впечатление, что нас хотят оставить полностью без еды. Там в контейнерах много продуктов. Полчаса назад было второе попадание в мой дом. Хорошо, что не в мой подъезд.
so this is a video where you can see the kind of panoramic overview of the city in this particular moment. And this is 10:20, 15 minutes after the theater was attacked, right? You can even barely see the smoke coming out of the theater that is behind the church. So you can see the type of environment that Mariupol was in that particular instance. And this is important to speak here. I don't know how well you know what happened in Mariupol, whether you watched certain films or footage from there, but it's very important for us to understand that when we focus on the theater and what's going on there, we also gain a lot of insight on what's been going on around it. So during the interviews, sometimes we opened maps and we asked people to kind of draw certain lines. Where were they and how did they get into the theater? And one of our witnesses is actually has a very unique story because he came to the theater in the morning of March 16th. His friend was somewhere in Mariupol, he didn't know where, and he was very worried for him, so he decided to go in from Mangush, which is a city outside of Mariupol, kind of against all the people that are going in front of him. And his trajectory is extremely well documented. He considered it necessary to film every 3 minutes, and he filmed these small fragments of footage. And I'll play a little bit of his interview where you can see, first you can see a kind of his approach to Mariupol.
Машины, это все машины блестят. Это колонна на Мариуполь. Вот это я еду уже вот так вот. Ну тут промежутки уже между машинами есть. Километров 5 уже вот такая очередь. Разорванные танки стоят. И вот еще один. Ну вот он Мариуполь. Развалины.
So, and this is another piece of material where you can see the theater, you can see the map in front of you, and it's a little bit further on his trajectory.
Коротше, я їхав сюди прямо, ці вулиці. Що не треба було робити? Вот. Это как раз дорога, которая вот эта дорога в Мордор. Точно. Как бы там был такой дым темный, что чем дальше я ехал, тем обзора вообще не было никакого. Я не знал, что там будет дальше вообще. Ну да, как бы я туда насквозь туда поехал. А когда я заехал под вот этот дым, ну там как бы темновато было очень. Начали еще свистеть эти мины.
Там горит. Что-то горит. Больница, роддом.
This is the maternity hospital that was also air-bombed a few days before the theater, and again, it's very important for us to show the scale of this and to, even within the story about the theater, which is located here to kind of to map these urban trajectories. And it's of course not the only example. When we have done that, there were a few witnesses who left the theater and decided to come back. I'm coming finally to the time when I'll share the floor with my colleagues, and I'll start from saying that within this work we produced two reports together with one of them was made by Garrett Collett, who's a defense consultant, and his materials are very important for us to understand the explosion, important to make assumptions about what kinds of air bombs were used in this particular case. So this will be also published on the website, and you'll be able to read it on the 16th of March. And the other one, which Isabelle will speak a little bit about, is the legal assessment by ECCHR. So since Vasily already introduced you, I feel like we should jump straight to the topic of law and the legal assessment.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today and for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to join this panel and the launch of this exceptional project. So first of all, congratulations to Maksym and colleagues at the Center for Spatial Technologies. As you mentioned, I'm speaking here today as a legal advisor at the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, a Berlin-based human rights organization that is using legal means to counter impunity for grave human rights violations worldwide. The focus of my work lies on international crimes and accountability, particularly for crimes committed in the war of aggression against Ukraine. And I'm very glad that as a team we were able to contribute a legal analysis of the airstrike on the Mariupol Drama Theatre to this project. And the detailed analysis, as Maksym mentioned, will be uploaded on the website. So I'm here today to give you an overview of the outcomes of the assessment. I did not decide to make a presentation because I felt like I could not live up to the great visuals that we were going to see here today. But just to give you an idea of what I will be speaking about in the following presentation, I would first like to say a few general words about the highly problematic legal framework for airstrikes affecting civilians during armed conflicts. I will then give a summary of our main findings with regard to the attack on the theater. And finally, I would like to speak about steps we are taking at ECCHR towards accountability for the international crimes committed in Mariupol. So to start out, I believe that a few critical remarks on the regulation of airstrikes harming civilians in general are necessary. And the conduct during armed conflict is generally regulated in international humanitarian law, which foresees which conduct is permissible, and then in international criminal law, which foresees individual responsibility for certain very grave breaches of these norms that then constitute war crimes. And the idea of these norms generally is an attempt to humanize warfare, at least to a certain degree, for example, through the fundamental rule that the parties to an armed conflict may not intentionally direct attacks against civilians or civilian objects, namely objects that are not making an effective contribution to military action. And such a direct attack against civilians then constitutes a war crime if the perpetrator knew that they were targeting civilians. And at the same time, and this is why I say humanization only to a certain degree, the underlying logic of the law is still that when the parties to an armed conflict are targeting combatants or military objectives, so-called civilian casualties, meaning harm to civilians or objects which serve civil purposes, are not generally prohibited. So to put it very bluntly, in principle, the current legal framework allows to harm civilians for military gains, at least to a certain degree. So airstrikes on military targets are therefore only prohibited if the harm to civilians can be expected to be excessive in relation to the military advantage anticipated, and the threshold for airstrikes to be considered a war crime is then even higher. So only if the commander conducting the airstrike could foresee that it would cause clearly excessive civilian harm does the commander commit a war crime by still conducting the airstrike. And therefore, in summary, prosecution for a war crime due to an airstrike is only possible if evidence shows that those ordering or executing an airstrike intentionally targeted civilians, or that they knew that a large number of civilians would be harmed in a strategically insignificant attack on a perceived military target. And this, of course, puts a very big emphasis on the perspective of the perpetrator. Hence, though many civilians have been harmed in airstrikes in conflicts all over the world, hardly any cases have been prosecuted for war crimes by airstrikes so far, let alone successfully. Though I have to mention that there's an important caveat to be made, because as some of you may know, the International Criminal Court just issued an arrest warrant concerning 2 Russian suspects a few days ago concerning airstrikes on electric infrastructure in Ukraine. And this is, of course, an important step. It remains to be seen how this goes forward, but still, I just want to highlight the exceptional nature of these arrest warrants. Now, on the airstrike on the Mariupol Drama Theatre in detail, as we all know, the Russian war of aggression has been characterized by relentless airstrikes on civilians and civilian objects all over Ukraine. We just saw examples on the footage that Maksym showed us, and the airstrike on the Mariupol Drama Theatre is one of the emblematic examples of this. And it is, according to our legal assessment, also an exceptionally clear-cut case which could already be prosecuted as a war crime under international criminal law as it stands at the moment. Now, the basis of our assessment was primarily the information gathered by the Center for Spatial Technologies, particularly through the 12 situated testimonies and the expert opinion on the explosion that Maksym mentioned. Moreover, we also reviewed open source information, for example, a very extensive report by Amnesty International that some might be familiar with, and also several very thorough press researches, which also commissioned or spoke to experts on the explosion. And based on this pool of information, there are some important premises for the legal assessment that I would like to briefly highlight before I go into the legal part. Now, all of the information which is currently available points towards a Russian airstrike, which was conducted with 1 or 2 500-kilogram bombs dropped from an airplane, causing the destruction of the theater. Experts questioned or assigned by Amnesty, Associated Press, BBC, and the Center for Spatial Technologies concur in the finding that based on the impact and scope of the destruction, this can be concluded. And as we heard from Maksym, by contrast, the claims raised by Russia that Ukrainian soldiers blew the theater up from within seems implausible based on the facts that are out there at the moment. As there is no visible crater of an explosion, the bomb rather likely exploded between the roof and the stage. This is one of the outcomes of the experts' findings. And none of the witnesses reported that the military had set up their headquarters, let alone placed explosives of several hundred kilograms on or above the stage. And I mean, the natural reaction of people within the theater seeing this would have been to flee the theater, but nobody reported that anything of the kind happened. Then, secondly, the available information does also not hint at the presence of any significant amount of Ukrainian military or territorial defense forces in or around the theater at the time of the attack, or any use of the theater for military purposes, which could have turned it into a military target. Witnesses mention that there were daily deliveries of aid by individual soldiers, and that possibly up to 3 or 4 individual members of territorial defense may have slept in a theater occasionally. It is not clear whether they did so in the night of 15th to 16th, and no military presence otherwise was visible on satellite images around the theater. And then thirdly, hundreds of civilians were present at the theater and sheltering there. While numbers vary, the Center for Spatial Technologies has come to the conclusion that it was likely around about 1,000 people who were still there at the time. And the use of the shelter was, on the one hand, publicly known. It was posted on the internet frequently. And it was also visible even from above, even on satellite images. So anyone overflying the theater could clearly see that there was a field kitchen outside and also the signs saying children in front of the theater on both sides that I'm sure all of us have also seen on the media. Now, against this background, we considered overwhelmingly likely that the attack actually constituted a war crime by Russian forces. Given that the explosive hit the theater very accurately above the stage on a day of good weather with no other structures around for approximately 100 meters, it is very likely that it was the chosen target. This is also the outcome of the expert reports. And the civilian nature of the building and the civilians present, as I mentioned, was also publicly known. So it is very likely that it was a war crime of intentionally targeting civilians and a civilian object. Now, even if the Russian military had wanted to target the few soldiers that were delivering aid or members of the territorial defense possibly present, the strike would still have been unlawful because they must have been aware that the civilian harm to be expected would be clearly excessive to any military advantage that they could expect. So they were dropping 1 or 2 500 kilograms bomb on a theater which was sheltering so many civilians. And this could only, if at all, have been justified if there was an extraordinarily high value military target. But this assumption seems absolutely unreasonable, and the claim of a perpetrator would therefore not be credible, because the Russian forces were obliged to conduct reconnaissance about the situation on the ground, and on this basis they must have been aware that the vast number of civilians was present and also that the theater was not used for military purposes. Now, and it should also be made entirely clear that simply terrorizing the civilian population is not a legitimate military aim. And on this basis, in any event, it would have constituted a war crime of a disproportionate attack. And finally, and this also ties in with Maksym has shown us about the relentless airstrikes that we saw on the rest of Mariupol, and the siege over months that we've also heard about. There are also strong indications that the attack could have been a crime against humanity. Now, this presupposes that it took place in the context of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population in Mariupol. And this, in turn, means that a broad number of persons must have been affected, or that there were patterns of violations, of grave human rights violations, that would indicate a policy behind the attacks. And currently, it is, of course, difficult to evidence this, because, as we heard, Mariupol is still under occupation. But there are several reports, for example, by the UN Commission of Inquiry, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and also Ukrainian and international non-governmental organizations that have started to gather evidence on this. And we believe that, given the extent to which civilians in Mariupol have been and still are affected, this should be part of any investigation into the attack. And this leads me to the last part of my presentation, in which I would like to say a few words about the specific steps that ECCHR is taking towards accountability for the attack on the Mariupol Drama Theatre and for other crimes committed in Mariupol, because we are currently pursuing several cases. Now, generally speaking, when crimes are committed, the state on whose territory this happens is responsible to investigate and also to prosecute them. In the case of international crimes, namely war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and arguably also the crime of aggression, besides this, third states are also permitted to step in, and moreover, the International Criminal Court can take on cases if the state has acknowledged its jurisdiction. In the case of Ukraine, unfortunately, it has not yet become a member of the International Criminal Court, but it has acknowledged its jurisdiction ad hoc. And against this background, the ICC has already issued 4 arrest warrants, the 2 ones that I mentioned before, and also, as you might have heard last year, the ones against Putin and Lova Belova for the deportation of children to Russia from Ukraine. And beyond that, Ukraine is currently faced with over 120,000 investigations already. It is against this background crucial that third states also step in and open investigations. We are therefore, for example, supporting 2 survivors of the attack on the Mariupol Drama Theatre who want to seek accountability for of perpetrators in submitting criminal complaints in Germany. And one recent positive example also concerns international crimes committed in Mariupol, namely in case of the killing of the Lithuanian filmmaker Mantas Kvedaravičius that some of you may have heard about in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, likely by Russian-backed so-called DNR forces. ECCHR is supporting the fiancé of the deceased in this case, and Lithuanian authorities have opened proceedings against 3 suspects. Now, it stands to be hoped that more states will open investigations into the attacks against the civilian population in Mariupol to hold those responsible to account. But these investigations can, of course, take a very long time, and it should be pointed out that it is not clear if the perpetrators can be apprehended in the long run. And we believe it is still important to preserve the evidence and issue arrest warrants because these crimes are not time-barred, and the likelihood that they are apprehended in the long run could be increased by this. At the same time, projects like the one presented here today by the Center for Spatial Technologies are crucial because they can already help to set the record straight or to explode the black box, as Maksym said in the beginning of his presentation, and give survivors a way to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation and for contributing with some of the even quite recent changes that the CCHR contributed to the study. And as I said, we will publish this on the website. But I just wanted to say one important thing, that for us it's been very important to not just be a database, right? To not just accumulate materials. As we were collaborating with different experts and with different scholars, we always felt like one way of looking at this is not enough. We always felt like, you know, there are limitations to each of these lenses through which we were looking. And all of the materials that we were amassing, we were frankly also slightly worried about the potential of just publishing them online as they are without explanation. So for that reason, it was very important for us to write and to write a series of essays that basically weave all of these materials together in a meaningful way. And one of the authors who worked with us is Svitlana Matviyenko, who's going to present the specific article that will also be published on the 16th of March. Svitlana.
Thank you very much, Maksym, and thanks, Isabelle, for a wonderful presentation. So I'm happy to continue now with, again, offering you yet another take, yet another language and perspective on this case. So, and my language is, let's say, it's a philosophical take. So I'm a scholar of warfare, but I come from philosophy and communication studies. So the tasks that I set for myself is to, again, offer certain conceptual means to process, to think current wars, right? Because as we see all the time, that sometimes terms used either in legal sphere and other spheres remain kind of, they always a little bit behind. And war, unfortunately, develops and unfolds with a very different speed. So I work in a somewhat speculative dimension, but at the same time, the accuracy of interpretation and data collected, and especially the work with witnesses, is extremely important for my work. So again, I want to thank you very much to Maksym and the Center for Spatial Technologies, the amazing team who gave me the opportunity to think together about this case. And I want to thank Kyiv Perennial and for also inviting me to participate here and present my thoughts. And I will speak today about the notion that I'm developing, terror environment, in relation to the Mariupol theater of war. And we will begin with matter. The bombing of the Mariupol Drama Theatre is an ultimate act of terror, but terror proliferated and continues proliferating beyond this act of violence. This presentation addresses some of the mechanisms and roots of its proliferation. Terror is ecological. It penetrates the networks of life-affirming connections to weaponize the organism's deep embeddedness in the environment. It invades the mechanisms supporting living body and turns them dangerous and even deadly. The material composition of terror environments is diverse. They are constituted by solid, liquid, and gaseous matter, from debris to pollution, moving at radically different speeds and in different directions. These environments are defined by sonic, olfactory, and thermal elements, from the wailing air alerts to punctuating explosions followed by shock waves, transferring energy at interfaces between tissues, producing that overall body's long memory of the shock that causes nearly unrecognizable slow destruction of life. Terror environments today also include a variety of informational objects, practices, and events from signal emission to jamming, instrumentalized to rupture or overturn initial communication, to psyops, propaganda, and random digital chaos often used to distort or control it. The subjects of war are caught in the complex materiality of the terror environments that they inhabit. It is crucial to consider how entangled all these material components of such environments are and how they interact by simultaneously impacting the behavior of the subjects of war. The perception of information, for example, does not happen in a vacuum. It is integrated in a network of existential material connections, from the sonic landscape that subjects inhabit to the quality of air they breathe, and probably to the freedom of movement they are granted or denied. The discrepancy between how frequently and successfully these aspects of terror environments are weaponized in military conflicts and how poorly the crucial nuances of their aggression are accounted for by the law opens the enormous possibilities for unpunishable violence. Constraint. War is a criminal act of aggression against citizens that is waged without the justification of self-defense and with the goal of territorial gain and subjugation. War is an industry of crimes that the International Criminal Court frames through the detailed system of laws of war. In the eyes of the law, there are limits to violence, or red lines, crossing which means committing a war crime. The topology of wars is that wars are crimes in themselves, different from war crimes, and at the same time, they contain war crimes. The bombing of the Mariupol theater by the Russian armed forces on March 16, 2022, is representative of such complexity. A premeditated and unlawful act of terrorism committed either by rebels or governments can be isolated, but it can also take place in the context of war. Terrorism is a form of warfare in which violence is directed towards civilians rather than the military. As historian Charles Tanchet writes, clearly war and terror are intimately related. However, The essence of terrorism, in contrast to war, he explains, is surely the negation of combat. Its targets are attacked in a way that inhibits or prohibits self-defense. Warfare is a merciless stratification of population onto less and least protected. Terrorism, amid the war, acts precisely upon the weakest. It is drawn to the most defenseless realms. The absence of a military no-fly zone over the territory of Ukraine, for which Ukrainian lawmakers and politicians called on NATO from the first day on a large-scale invasion, gave the Russian Federation the green light to continue bombing Ukrainian cities and towns, so that Ukrainian civilians all over Ukraine are consistently targeted by incendiary weapons, cluster bombs, as well as cruise missiles, ballistic rockets, and drones at a long range. The degree of vulnerability of Mariupol in particular depends on these political decisions. Volume. Where the notion of territory remains crucial for reporting, analyzing, and narrativizing the war, the latter transgressed a traditional sense of two-dimensional territory at least a century ago. In the 80s, philosopher Paul Virilio described this change in warfare as a move from battlefield to a battle space, envisioned through the categories of distance, depth, and three-dimensionality. Space became a training ground for the dynamic offensive, for all the energies it harnessed. Drawing on Virilio, political scientist Stuart Eldon theorized a vertical dimension of territory, claiming that territory is a volume rather than the area. Philosopher Peter Sloterdijk went further to propose that the discovery of the environment took place in the trenches of World War I, referring to the practices of deploying gas as a weapon. To that end, he provocatively claimed the 20th century was shaped by the paradoxical convergence of the practice of terrorism with environmental thinking. Such environmental awareness is not prerogative to an aggressor only. It also characterizes the targeted subject entrapped by the war. In fact, it situates both an aggressor and a target in a deadly relation where they operate as part of a single assemblage. The aggressor aiming at suppressing by terror or eliminating the target entirely, and the target fighting for survival by any means available. The image produced by Spatial Technologies on March 14, 2022, demonstrates such a relation. The residents of the shelter in the theater drew the Russian word "дети" in two locations on the square outside the theater the very same day. The accuracy with which they determined the necessary size of the letters so they could be seen from a military airplane demonstrates that they were able to estimate the scope of the voluminous battle space they inhabited along with the aggressor. This awareness makes the temporary residents of the theater the subjects of war. The targeted subject of the battle space is split. Terror generates the impossibility of choosing an ultimate survival strategy. According to the witnesses, the sign was, of course, an attempt to identify the building to attacking forces as a civilian air raid shelter hosting children and not a military target. But at the same time, they were very much aware that this sign could actually entice the aggressor. And not that people really shared either that side or that side, but the split of the subjects of war is very important. The subject of war is constituted by the split, by leaving these two possibilities at the same time. This typically identifies the general uncertainty and isolation between different survival strategies suggested by the group members who were trapped in this battle space. Routine. Although terror is typically associated in military and political theory with direct attacks, such bombing with attacks and bombing, understanding the war environmentally allows one to see how the terror environment persists after the direct attacks. And you probably already see in my presentation that I'm very much interested how this terror environment proliferates after the bombing. So what's happening, what it causes, what kind of conditions it poses, what possibilities for violence it opens in the months to come. In May 2022, the combat operations in the city were still ongoing at the Azovstal iron and steel works, where the Ukrainian armed forces held resistance for 80 years, until their surrender on March 16th. But already then, the cleanup of ruined buildings for the upcoming so-called reconstruction of the city began, often referred as to the creation of Russian New Potemkin village. The master plan of Mariupol reconstruction was developed and approved by the Ministry of Construction of Russia, together with the subordinate Unified Institute of Spatial Planning of the Russian Federation, and the decree was signed by the head of the so-called Donetsk Republic, Denis Pushilin, on July 30, 2022. The videos by pro-Russian bloggers obtained from their channels document the preparation for the realization of this incoming plan on the occupational reconstruction. The video from June 22 is representative of how the terror environment is structured under the conditions of so-called peace amid the war. The square, as we see it, is full of people who were drawn there by the occupational forces to receive a bag of so-called humanitarian aid. The line that is formed in a proximity to the ruins is long, and the crowd, especially and the crowded, and it's get even tighter, closer to the trucks with the aid. The square is packed with people. A woman in line speaks of being humiliating. All trucks have big screens installed on the side, transmitting the Russian news by the government-controlled channel Россия 1. We hear fragments of reports about the beginning of the fishing season in Kamchatka. Soon we hear the voice of the Russian most famous propagandist Vladimir Solovyov. The distant explosions are continuously heard in the background. A big power generator near the theater allows people to charge their phones, and we know that electricity is low and scarce. The practices that constitute the city routine on the square near the bombed theater are congruent in how they operate within the terror environment. Shortage of food supply, the obligatory experience of rotting matter under the ruins, the sound of explosions, the presence of military people, and propaganda. So all these are conditions, objects, and experiences that constitute this environment of terror on the central square. While the residents are waiting for the allowed portion of food, The screens mounted on the trucks proceed with propaganda. The Ukrainian internet providers are replaced by the Russian state-owned providers, and there is not enough electric power or elementary knowledge to run VPN. The combination of needs and experiences is an effective way of persuading, so-called persuading, the subject within the terror environment to submit to the occupational power. And then there is a concert. On September 10th, 2022, the day of the 79th anniversary of Mariupol's liberation from the Nazi occupation during World War II, the current pro-Russian occupational regime hosted a dual-purpose concert staged on the ruins of the drama theater. First, the event was used for indoctrination of citizens on a new status of Mariupol as a Russian city. And second, the concert served for content production to be broadcast to broader audiences on the occupational territories, featuring the State Kremlin Orchestra of Russia and Russian actor, people's artists Alexander Mikhailov, known for openly supporting so-called Lugansk and Donetsk republics along with Russian invasion of Ukraine. The concert opened with the address from the head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, read by a representative, followed by another address by a deputy head of the Department of Presidential Affairs of the Russian Federation, Olga Lyakina, emphasizing the rootedness of the city in Russian culture. Russian music will be heard in Mariupol, in Russian Mariupol, they say. The concert featured the State Kremlin Orchestra performing Russian romantic composer Pyotr Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 4 in Fa minor, known for its appeal to the patriotic and heroic feelings, and described by music scholars as the apotheosis of imperial style. The overall mise-en-scene and the composition of the news episodes for television broadcast in the Russian Federation and the Russian-controlled occupied territories of Ukraine are rather straightforward, cutting from the scenes of the performance to the scenes of the audience or the representatives of the occupational government and back again, with occasional zooming in and out to show faces. These official news episodes construe the public event as an encounter between the audience of Mariupol residents, the Russian officials, and the representatives of so-called republics with Russian performance. The space they design is square, and the scenes of the ruined theater make the fourth component of such composition to serve as a perspective on the performance. The television viewer, thus, is led to believe that the four components of the space of this event, people under occupation, occupational government, patriotic graphomania, and imperial music, they are all brought back together and they are all in concert. And finally, screen. A close examination of various recordings of the concert reveal a more complex spatial organization of the event, allowing a glance behind the scene shown by the governmental controlled TV. The reconstructed street view around the drama theater demonstrates the full architecture of the event that deserves our attention. First of all, the broader picture reveals a different power dynamics and different groups of actors involved in this event, including apparently not one, but two audiences. A primary group of people, viewers seated in front of the stage, and a remote group of people, residents separated from the primary audience by the line of security guards and a wide cleared street space, but also by a fence. This video is recorded by a viewer from actually behind the fence. The reconstruction shifts our attention from the performance, as shown on TV, to the primary audience in front of the stage. They are at the center, and the event is indeed organized about them and around them. The remote audience, the second-order observers, watches the primary audience, the first-order observers, placed into a securitized perimeter in front of the ruin. The focus of attention is switched to how one looks instead of what one sees, or indeed the fact that one is capable of looking at all at the performance on this site of murder. A reconstructed street view shows a production scene. The subject of the terror environment is reproduced there to be immediately reified and mediatized as a content of propaganda. The topology of the media environment today is that a digital object travels the convoluted rules to multiple destinations simultaneously. So a Russian news episode for TV in fragments or as a whole also reaches Ukrainian viewer through social network, investigative or research project, or randomly, despite blockages on all sides. The encounter with this incredibly troubling performance for anyone in Ukraine is almost unavoidable. But so, what does it show? What does this episode, this video show? The people in front of the concert stage look at the camera or turn away. Some faces are relaxed or indifferent, others are tense. Some are laughing, others are annoyed by the camera gaze. It looks like some actually enjoy the verses. It seems that patriotic lines actually resonate with them, but then they look bored by Tchaikovsky. They listen to the officials, congratulating them on their liberation. They even seem to pay attention. In the end, this is a new regime, and whatever they think about it, pro, against, or indifferent, for them, the whole event is also a learning experience to some degree, at least for survival purposes. They are here, no way of easily getting out, and sometimes no will either, held by their surviving houses, the remains of community, by their gardens and graves. The proximity of their faces on the screens is deceiving. Zooming in doesn't bring the viewer closer, probably only further, due to the increasing opacity of mediation and the enforced narratives running over the footage. What do we see? What are we watching? This is just Russian TV.
Thanks so much, dear colleague. Okay, right.
I just wanted to summarize these presentations, and I have a final few things to say. First of all, again, as I already tried to advertise it, the website is coming out very soon, and this materials and Svitlana's essay will also be on it. I wanted to close this presentation by also wanted to mention Ksenia Rybak, whose essay will be also published on the website, and she worked with us very closely writing 2 essays describing the events that basically preceded the attack and the bombing itself. And I just also in the end wanted to say that, you know, what you saw during the presentation today and what you heard in these kind of guest performances, if I can say that, is the materials that form the kind of polyphonic image of this attack, show it from different angles, and that was very much our intention. But it's very much important to, again, wrap this by saying that for us it's very important for the stories of witnesses to be heard. And all of these materials are assembled in a way that would strengthen them. So in this way, I also wanted to provide a disclaimer that as an organization that conducted this research, it's very important for us to admit and acknowledge the fact that we don't want to play in the game of neutrality and of kind of objective gaze, right? So we are very much kind of a clearly sided organization, and our side is the most vulnerable, and in this case, these are the witnesses' interviews with who will be published on the website. So for us, this experience has been very important, and you hopefully will see the results very soon. Beyond documenting this specific event, local event in Mariupol, we also want to say that we want to basically use this work as solidarity, to foster solidarity with all victims of Russian imperial wars. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much indeed for these very deep and thought-provoking talks. We are also looking much forward to your questions and comments. Just maybe to make the first input on my end. Just short questions that I was just wondering. Maybe to start with you, Isabelle, if I may. As Svitlana so succinctly put it, that the war is a crime itself, right? But at the same time, the crime which contains so many other war crimes. And I'm just wondering, again, maybe it's quite simplistic, but maybe from a litigation point of view, right? From what kind of juridical perspective is that you have, maybe you can develop and explain a bit, why do we need these exact concrete cases to investigate? Why cannot we treat the assault as such, as already something to be punished properly? Why we have to go into the outcomes or the proceedings of the ongoing assault in order to bring it to the court and to make it a juridical case? So maybe it's again quite simplistic, but I'm just wondering how this system operates and what are you exactly paying attention to, if I'm quite clear.
Yeah, so it's definitely not a simple question, but very much goes to the heart of the gaps we still see in the international justice structure. So it definitely, from my point of view, is a clear case of a crime of aggression as such, which, as you correctly said, should be distinguished from the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that we also see there. The problem with regard to the crime of aggression, which in this case also opens the door for all of the other crimes and which should therefore definitely also be prosecuted, is that the International Criminal Court at the moment, due to the unwillingness of states to include this crime in the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, does not have jurisdiction in this case because Russia is not a member state. And back when the crime of aggression was included in the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, states decided that the court should not have jurisdiction to treat crimes of non-members, the crime of aggression of non-member states. by contrast to war crimes and crimes against humanity, which is definitely a very big gap and should be reformed. But this ultimately depends on the will of the member states to do so. So we do see a bit of a momentum towards this at the moment, which is important and should definitely go forward. And at the same time, there's also, or has been a big discussion going on for the last 2 years to set up a special tribunal for Ukraine, specifically because of what you said, that this is how all of the other crimes are, of course, or have started. And it's very hard to watch that those ultimately responsible for this crime cannot be held accountable. And the crime of aggression is being investigated in several third states. So under the principle of universal jurisdiction that I mentioned earlier, these third states are looking into it. But in front of the national courts, the president, the foreign minister, so the head of state, the head of government, and the foreign minister would enjoy immunity and could not be prosecuted. This is not the case in front of the International Criminal Court, and this is also why there are these discussions about a special international tribunal that could then potentially hold the perpetrators accountable. There is already broad international efforts to collect evidence. There's an international center that has been set up specifically to collect evidence and on the crime of aggression and to provide it either to the International Criminal Court or to a special tribunal in the long run. But for now, there is no international court yet that has this jurisdiction.
And maybe just as a follow-up, exactly to pick up where you just left it, a short question to Maksym. You several times underlined quite an interesting term, especially in the current framework, which is polyphony, or polyphonic testimonies, and this kind of approach. And I'm just wondering, because as we learned, for instance, last week, as we were hosting the Reckoning Project Ukraine Testifies initiative, right? And in their methodology, they were and still are constantly sort of emphasizing some type of neutrality of their approach. In the way they approach the witnesses, they collect testimonies, they document. But here, in your case, a polyphonic dimension is something much more than just neutrality. So, could you please give us a short take of yours? What is this polyphonic treatment of the idea of a document that you embrace? Yeah.
Thank you. This is a helpful question also for me, because we work quite closely with different organizations, and sometimes it can get a little bit confusing because we are sitting in the same building with ECCHR, right? Like human rights lawyers. We are talking to people who are experts in memory studies and memorialization, philosophers and theorists. And sometimes we talk to them, and as a result of conversation, we realize that we are not either of those things, right? Because our practice is different, and our practice is based on asking a conceptual question and addressing it through the lens of space and spatial studies. And in that way, we were simply trying through this project to find a place where we can be truly useful. So our assessment of this story is that, as I said in the end, we know where we stand, we know where our kind of engaged objectivity is. And this is next to the witnesses who in our studio sit in front of the screen and they see all of these documents, media, they see the models, and they work with us to produce certain kinds of images that would not be out there otherwise. And in that way, I see the work as building a type of scaffolding around the testimonies and around the lens of seeing these events through the eyes of the witnesses. And in that case, again, this is, for some reason, the most asked question that I've had in presentations, I'm not sure why, is about use of AI in visual evidence. And it doesn't only concern to that, it concerns to any kind of claims of kind of materials being unfaithful. Our answer will always be that, you know, because of this triangulation, because of connection of people's stories with photographs, we modeled certain spaces with people a couple of times, and then we saw those same spaces on images, and we understand that there is a meter of a difference where something stood, but it doesn't change the fact that these people were there and they channel a very specific type of environment around them, and in that way it was important for us to record it in a framework that can also stand time. And I can say very briefly that our work before had to do with Bab Yar and with Holocaust studies, and it was very difficult to work with materials from tribunals, from Soviet tribunals. So we were aware of issues of kinds of so-called evidence when it produced in a way that does not kind of go against, according to this methodology, where we actually deliberately and very carefully tried to kind of connect different types of information together into an assemblage that you will soon see on the 16th of March on our website.
Yeah, thanks.
I will just add on this point, because I think for me, working with the team, it was quite an interesting also moment of discovery about their methodology, but also I found it was extremely interesting. So like to reiterate a little bit what Maksym said, I guess we could say that there are, of course, means very much available and known to the team how to continue investigation after the bombing, right? So there are ways of diving in through various channels and see who is there, who is not there, who was doing what, and etc. But the investigation stops at the witness. It stops with the witness. And I think it is very interesting ethical position, but also methodological position that gives us actually a lot to think about. Why stop there, right? So the witnesses whom we heard and whom you can watch here, right? So they left the city, and in a certain way, someone like myself can go speculate further what it means to live in the enclosure. But that's how I already identify my language and my position differently, right? So, and I am trying to understand what this kind of, you know, production of these enclosures and a possibility or not, or impossibility of seeing through them, right? So, but that's of course a different story. And maybe steps like that have to be made, and that's why I'm making them, because I also want to contribute to knowing what is happening. But that's where we're different, and I think it's difference, it's crucial. And I think what the team, what really introduced something incredibly interesting and valuable but with this very interesting stop with the witness. So witnesses left, nobody could be talked to, we stopped pondering through the deep webs and etc., right? So we are working with people. And then there is a terror environment there, so, and we will think differently about it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, please just raise your hand, introduce shortly, and I will be perhaps assisting you with the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these presentations. I wanted to ask either Maksym or Svitlana, because both of you work a lot with media and media theory and the critics of media. When in this environment of terror, which media are a big part of, as we can understand, how do you think, where is, or if it is there still a place for subjects, not victims, not terrorized objects, like what is, where, and if it's even possible, even when we try to talk about them? Because today, when I saw these faces, I was thinking that actually they are sitting and these ruins are on their backdrop, but actually in this environment they were like a backdrop, like ours backdrop, and also, yeah, like this gaze, like how to direct it, how to watch.
It's a great question, thank you. And it's, of course, the interviews were made to be watched not like this, right? They're made to be watched, they will be publicly presented on YouTube. And I'll just say a few words about my personal experience of specifically this kind of question of subject. We kind of been surrounded by human rights lawyers and experts from forensic architecture who have years of studying human rights violations through media. Were very much prepared about dangers of re-traumatization and potentially kind of issues related to talking to witnesses in the way that we did, right? And while the team contacted witnesses and while we also received a lot of no to an invitation to speak to us, we also noticed among people who wanted to talk to us that there were much more than subjects of interrogation, right? There were much more than people who, okay, I'll tell you if you ask me, right? These were people who were very much actively and still very much actively asking us where are the presentations, when will we see interviews, kind of pushing for their stories to be heard. This process that you saw on the screen is very laborious. It takes from 3.5 to 7 hours to work in the studio to build these models, and some of the witnesses were asking to stay for longer. They wanted to, make more of things that they remember. The woman who was in charge of the shelter, Yevgenia Zabogonska, whose interview will be also published on the website, used the word exciting when she described how they solved the problem of feeding 2,000 people and kind of surviving in this environment of. So in that way, what we faced when we started talking to people is an insane sense of agency. And the sense of agency that seems to come from the theater and from this environment where volunteers organized and actually are very proud of what they managed to achieve within the theater. And in that way, your question is spot on because you cannot see it in this presentation, but you will be able to see it if you start watching the interviews. And again, this is why I'm constantly repeating that, very much hoping that that's gonna work out.
And I will add that, of course, the word subject has many meanings, right? So, and it depends what framework you are using. And obviously, in what Maksym now just said, you can see how, for him, it's related to agency from what I hear, right? So for me, it's not. So where I come, like, for instance, from psychoanalytical or Lacanian approach to the notion of the subject. For me, it's it's not an individual, let's say, it's more of a placeholder. So there is a particular position, right? So certain situatedness that is the subject, that is structural position. And that's what I'm trying to investigate. Someone who appears on that position acts and behaves in a particular way just because they are there. And what this split, which actually quite works against a possibility of agency, not that it denies it completely, obviously, but it definitely kind of arrests that agency, right? So, and that's how I use the word subject. And when I constantly repeat the subject of what is produced, so I'm seeing at this particular locations and how these places are locked, right? So, and people, let's say individuals appear there to become those arrested in war, in the terror environments. And that's where I continue thinking about certain materiality of terror that actually produces those kind of like arrests, those possibilities on all levels, from breathing to reading the news or not being able to read the news. And that's why I really insist that's kind of somehow because I was interviewed so much about the situation in Ukraine, and because my profile says that I'm a specialist on disinformation, I've been constantly asked by all world media about how people perceive disinformation, why Russians perceive disinformation, how Ukrainians perceive disinformation. And I'm saying we cannot speak about disinformation as such. We need to speak about what people breathe at this moment, and whether they hear the air alarm or whether they actually hear explosions. Those things are material elements of the environment that really impact how they perceive information. And also what they read also impact how they breathe. And with this kind of multi-layered kind of system of this terror, I think it's quite an interesting thing. And maybe it opens a kind of a new possibilities, again, like to think about what has to be punished, what is violence indeed, right? So, and how, like, even legally is possible to account for what this complexity. Yeah. Yeah, I meant to say something else, but I guess that's probably enough, yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for this breathtaking presentation. I'm Martin. I'm a researcher at Maastricht University, lecturer at Fresenius University of Applied Science, and a tech fellow of a well-known investigative network. And I just want to say that I'm still in constant disbelief that we still have to debunk obvious lies. And I have the highest respect for your work, for detail-oriented legal expertise, like Isabelle's, for the insightful contextualization of Svitlana, or of the tedious work of Maksym and his work and his team. I know this is a team effort, and I know that this is not easy because it comes with it comes with a vicarious trauma. It's not easy work. But this debunking of obvious lies by this kind of tedious work is very important, because obvious is speculation. And we don't need speculation. We need evidence. And the converging evidence that you showed is exactly what we need. And I just want to express my thanks. I had other questions, but I'll leave the floor to others. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much. That was very amazing. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Konstantin. Thank you so very much for this presentation. I'm deeply impressed by the approach of witnesses working together with 3D modelists. So I have a question. Do you plan something like this investigation also for Azovstal? I'm extremely interested in what happened to Azovstal, among others, which might be another question of war crime, as a surgical hospital in Azovstal was bombed. And I would wish for something like this, for this kind of witnesses in 3D modeling, to understand, to finally realize what happened here, because I have watched a lot of interviews with soldiers and civilians who were trapped in Azovstal, but I still struggle to see it topographically, geographically. So.
Thank you. We were looking a lot at Azovstal footage, and at some point, if we called this work a city within a building, Azovstal is literally a city in a city. And it took us 2 years to reconstruct a building. The short answer is no. We are at this point finalizing this work, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done after we publish it. And after that, we currently are not sure what the next investigation is going to be, other than some of the small things that we're doing, but Azovstal is not among them. Thank you for that question.
Thanks for your great presentation, and I have a question for Isabelle. So in the 20th century legal tradition, there is this quite clear distinction between civilians and combatants, and which is kind of formal, like if you are in the military or some paramilitary group, you're like combatant, and if you're not, you're civilian, just paying taxes and so on. But I think, especially with the Russian-Ukrainian war, it's very clear that like a lot of Ukrainians, we are kind of obviously non-combatants, but we donate money, we do certain different kind of activism, and like a lot of people in Ukraine, especially in the first weeks of the war, they were actually super involved in defending their hometowns, while not really being kind of combatants or kind of servicemen. And so I'm just wondering, like, this fuzziness, does it really present any interesting kind of challenges or maybe even opportunities for the legal framework? Because, like, obviously there is this, I'm not making a point that the fact that people donate money or kind of help the minority, that it makes them kind of it makes targeting them justifiable. Of course not. Yeah, because obviously I think that military, servicemen are also shouldn't be killed in an unjust war. So for me personally, it just doesn't make any moral kind of moral significance in here. But still, do you think that the traditional approaches can be updated to reflect this complexity and to maybe even make persecuting Russian war crimes actually easier, to kind of debunk this idea that, well, these civilians, they were kind of volunteering, or they were kind of sometimes combatants and so on. So what do you think about it? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think that, of course, there is some fuzziness in this way of civilian support, but still I would say that the legal framework is in itself rather clear-cut on these questions. So donating money is definitely, as you already said, not a reason to qualify anyone as a combatant, while taking up arms and supporting or even, for example, as the territorial defense, even being integrated into the armed forces, does qualify the person as combatant. And I think that it is very, very important to keep this very, very clear line up and not blur it further. I also think that in the case of the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, blurring the line would actually not benefit the civilians on the ground, but rather make the situation even more dire and more difficult. And what you were mentioning about accountability for the killing of Ukrainian soldiers, that ties back in with the question concerning the war of aggression itself, right? Because there is this distinction in the legal framework between the right to wage a war and the rules on the ground if an armed conflict is ongoing, and that there are certain rules when an armed conflict is ongoing that apply to all of the parties on the ground, I believe is very important. At the same time, we can never lose sight of the overarching question that, as you say, the crime of aggression in itself is illegal, and therefore, of course, that also, for example, the killing of combatants would constitute a violation of their right to life, as a human right. But that's a different legal layer. So I think it's not really an easy answer to your question there, but I believe that if at all, we should work towards outlawing law itself even more and making the rules stricter, but not blurring them towards including more persons that are currently considered to be civilians into the framework.
Thanks. Maybe any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, all three of you. And I have a question for, I think, especially for Svitlana, for your concept of the subject as, well, I don't know how to put it, but rather as a meeting point for different circumstances and not as a subject in a sense of agency. And when I see, for example, those Russians listening to the concert in front of the destroyed drama theater, how would you conceptualize guilt, for example, or responsibility? Because in my opinion, those persons are, of course, in a certain sense, responsible for what they are doing. And for example, there must have been a pilot throwing the bomb and stuff like that. I don't know. Maybe you know what I mean. How would you think about responsibility of the Russian side, agency?
Yeah, thanks for bringing me back to the question of the subject, especially because I did recall what I wanted to say. So now I will. And I guess the question about the responsibility of those responsible, right, from the soldiers to agents of empire, occupational forces, and etc., probably lies more in the legal sphere, and I think there it's pretty clear. Myself, I am indeed more interested in the subject of war as someone who is mostly in my research a civilian, right? So, but of course it could be also a soldier, but I'm mostly writing as civilian, right? And for instance, if we get back to this concert, I think it's quite an interesting stage in the process of producing that subject, which I again forgot to mention, but now if we recall that scene with the audience, this co-audience sitting in front of the theater, right? So it's not that, as far as I think, as far as I saw through a number of videos and materials, etc., what's interesting for me is that this group of people is like so subjectified as a content for propaganda, right? So they're reified and mediatized. So in a certain way, and that's precisely where I finished my presentation, the complete lack of access to them, right? So to the extent that, of course, you would want to think how they feel and why they behave as they behave and why someone doesn't protest, although we know all the answers to this, why, right? So they are in the enclosed environment that they cannot leave, right? So, and that's a kind of a extremely heavy situation. But then at the same time, what it's interesting that in this incredibly vulnerable and scared and suppressed position, we also see someone who immediately is abused and becoming the content for Russian propaganda. And that's, of course, a constant strategy, a constant technique. We see it on all different levels. We see it with anybody who arrested or detained, with the soldiers, with whoever, right? So confessions under torture, and then everything becomes news. Everything becomes propaganda. And with this reification for, you know, propaganda news, it's quite an interesting, almost final stage of producing that particular subjective position that is visible, right? So everyone knows that that's what kind of like awaits them, right? So that they would be confessing, that they would be pushed to say something, right? So the subject of war is someone who would eventually be forced to do anything, or sometimes even to be mobilized to war and fight against Ukrainians, right? So, but this subject of war is a kind of endlessly reifiable, we could say it, right? So position. That's what the terror of that position is. What's something that I'm trying to think about and study.
Yeah, and perhaps the last question.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for all presentations, because I found seeing them all together really also made a few things clear, like in combination, how we think about information and really the centrality of the Mariupol Drama Theatre, as you said also in the title, as a city in the building. Like, I found it really fascinating to see how you were so careful in converging limited information, being very careful how to really reconstruct that also from direct memory. And then it again becomes a site of transformation where where the Ukrainian city of Mariupol becomes an occupied city, and then again the site where information or lack of information is used for content production to then be extrapolated again. And so I'm thinking about this kind of converging onto the building, the drama theater, the on-staging, off-staging of information. And I just wonder how you would even see, like, also your work as evidence or something that could reverse this process later. I mean, how to imagine then a deoccupation again of Mariupol and what you produced, maybe also to ease things like moral injury, which I think is normally in soldiers, but even here with the civic population, when you had the image of the different audiences, as you just said, they're used in this way as a very vulnerable population. I don't know, I don't really have a question, but maybe some reflections again on the title and the centrality of the building as a military target.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I can actually just start answering if it's okay. What I want to do in my research, I want to contribute to thinking about, again, what that hopefully future that hopefully will be there about the deoccupation, etc. So, and the way how you want to contribute to that is precisely to think with this complexity, because we are all, like in Ukraine, there are processes of writing laws on collaboration and etc. And there are drafts and attempts. And what I know about this and what I read about this, it's quite problematic. And in this extremely difficult situation, when we are lacking people on the front lines, where the responsibility is really kind of spread and there is no avoidance of this and etc. etc. You know, like, I mean, obviously it's difficult in this moment to think about what collaboration means when you're constantly targeted. And yet we have to think about this, hoping that there will be an end, and then we need to think about how to talk about responsibilities, right? So, and that's what I want to also problematize some potential issues that may be part of that conversation. What thinking about these constraints, and these constraints are local, but they're also international, right? So think about who contributed and how those places, this terror, this particular subjects were produced, right? So, and the difficulty that people encountered and whatnot. So again, it's a very difficult conversation. I myself really lost in it, I must say, and lost in it every month in a different way because situation changes and my answers that I find are getting lost again. But that's what I think, that's how I see what I'm doing here. Mm-hmm.
I can only say that to me, this question basically brings us back to the Russian strategy of kind of repeating these acts of violence enough times that it kind of doesn't matter. You know, that's how it feels like to work with this when we see new attacks every week, new kind of footage of destroyed houses and stuff like that. So in this moment for us, for the team, it was very hard to decide what to do, you know, and at some point we just focused on one specific place where we felt like a lot of forces are converging, and we wanted to do it as good as we can. And in that case, it's not a scalable exercise. It's very hard to do this with every of these attacks, but for us it was important to still insist on kind of possibility of ground truth and showing how it can be done in this particular case. And again, the insist on accountability, even though, you know, there are so many reasons against it. So, of course, we cannot talk much about what will happen when the occupation will happen and how this will be useful. For us, it's something that is much more rooted in what we can do now and what kinds of things we can also lose now. Having this kind of strategy of, you know, the more of this, the less you can do. And in that particular context, again, this is where working with witnesses was so important for us, because even recently, before publication, we had a call with all of our witnesses and we shared some of the outcomes of this research, and some of them were saying that, oh, sorry, this is, I already forgot this. It's good that it's that we conducted this in the summer previous year. So yeah, that would be my response.
Yeah, I think we have to leave it exactly there, but just, yeah, still, we will be continuing, of course, throughout our program to tackle those problematic fields, but I think the biggest question that still remains unanswered just because of its very specific and somehow undefined internal mechanism is how to stop terror. Because it's such a, as Svitlana put it, such a proliferating environment that it's not only, of course, a Ukrainian issue. So thank you so much again, Maksym Rokmaniiko, Svitlana Matviyenko, Isabelle Haßfurther. Thanks so much for this, and we look much forward to see you next week on Saturday. You are more than welcome to attend our next event, which will be dedicated to the decolonial issues in Eastern Europe as a theory and as well as political practice. It will be at 5 p.m., but at the other location of Kyiv Perennial at Between Bridges on Adelbertstrasse. Thank you so much. I think we can continue in more informal manner. Thanks for coming.